Hello and welcome. I am Rajiv Gupta, a certified trainer and a senior technician at PCMacPlus.com. Today I'm going to review the key points pertaining to processor sockets, a subsection of A Plus certification Domain 1 hardware section 1.2H. One of the important features of a motherboard is the processor socket. The socket and the chipset determine which processors a board can support. A socket will hold either an Intel or AMD processor. Some older processors were installed on the motherboard in long, narrow slot, but all processors sold today use sockets. PGA, SPGA, and LGA sockets are all square or nearly square, so that even force is applied when inserting the processor in the socket. All current processor sockets have a lever on the side of the socket. These sockets are called zero insertion force (ZIF) sockets, and this lever is used to lift the processor up and out of the socket. You push the lever down and the processor moves its pin or land connectors with equal force over the entire housing. With this method, you can easily remove and replace the processor if necessary. However, know that processors generally should not be removed or replaced repeatedly because this can damage the delicate pins or socket holes. So here you can see this is where the processor is placed. This is the lever that we are talking about. This is the cover. This right here is the processor, and you place the processor in here, and here they have a certain configuration that you need to follow, because you see these notches right here. There's a notch here and there's a notch here. That notch is supposed to go the same way that you see this processor socket. So keep that in mind. There's no force allowed in any of the sockets, whether they are PGA or LGA. They should simply slide in. Earlier Pentiums used a pin grid array called PGA socket, with pins aligned in uniform rows around the socket. Later, sockets used staggered pin grid array, which is SPGA, with pins staggered over the socket to squeeze more pins into a small space. Small pins can easily be bent as the processor is installed in the socket. Later, Intel sockets used a land grid array (LGA) that uses lands rather than pins. The first LGA socket is the LGA 775 socket. It has 775 lands, which is 775 lands, and is shown with the socket lever and top open in the slide above. The lands look like tiny pads that the pins on the processor contact. As you can see, the array of pins which connect the processor to the motherboard are now attached to the socket, and they are very fragile and easily bent. All socket 775 motherboards feature the metal shim load plate, which is called pictured above, which serves the dual purpose of locking down the processor once it is installed and protecting the pins from harm when it is not. Most boards also implement a protective plastic cover which fits over the load plate when no processor is present, hiding the pins completely. The lever secures the shim in place, holding the processor when it is installed. It is extremely important that the processor be installed slowly, carefully, and vertically into the socket and removed the same way. Any careless handling will damage the pins and may leave you with a useless motherboard. With Intel Socket 775 processor form factor, Intel has accomplished a couple of noteworthy things. The first was to substantially reduce the complexity and cost of manufacturing its processor, removing the vulnerable and delicate interface pins from the bottom of the CPU meant that manufacturer losses and customer returns both dropped significantly for Intel. The second accomplishment was, unfortunately, to increase the complexity and risk involved in installing one of the new 775 processors into the motherboard. By removing the pins from each CPU, Intel offloaded the responsibility of adding interface pins to motherboard manufacturers who also now have to deal with returned merchandise and angry customers with bent socket pins. This is a bad thing for Intel users in general, as now the motherboards is the most likely component to be damaged during an installation gone bad, and compared to Intel, many motherboard manufacturers are notoriously unreliable in providing replacement parts. The latest Intel socket is the LGA 1366. It's called a land grid array socket, but the LANs in the socket are actually more like pins that connect with the LANs on the bottom of the processor. The display shows an LGA 1366 socket with the load plate and load lever lifted so that the socket is open and ready to receive the processor. LGA 1366 server CPU socket is a server CPU socket designed for Intel's Nehalem microarchitecture that uses an LGA 1366 pin packaging and smaller pitch size of 1.016 by 1.016 millimeter, also commonly known as socket B, socket 1366 or LGA 1366. This socket mates with the server processor through the gold paths of LGA 1366 package. With Intel's reputation of building stable chipsets, it seems as though almost everyone was looking forward to the release of their i845D chipset, the chipset which would finally bring official DDR support to the Pentium 4. Now that the i845D has arrived and become widely available to consumers, a host of other manufacturers have entered the race and released similar chipsets which offer the same level of performance. The most obvious components you will need to get is of course the Pentium 4 processor. Here is the chart of all the sockets and the processors that are used on these sockets and the description that you need to know for your exam. So you must study the LGA 1366 socket, LGA 771, LGA 775, and socket 478 and socket 423. Choosing the right motherboard when AMD or Intel decide to change memory standard is never a fun proposition. There are always two choices. You can stick to the existing memory format that's plentiful and cheap, or future-proof your computer by adopting the new memory type that's always more expensive and generally less plentiful on store shelves. In this respect, the sticker shock of DDR3 RAM isn't as bad as it used to be. Intel broke the word into DDR3 memory a while back. A DDR3 memory isn't hard to find, and there are many different speeds to choose from. The socket AM3, made by AMD Advanced Micro Devices, Phenom 2 X3 and X4 processor, bridged the memory between the prudent backward compatibility on socket AM2 plus motherboards. AMD is nice that way, not forcing you to buy 3 sticks of DDR when the economy is all doomy and gloomy. As you glance over the table, you will notice that the same processor family listed under several different sockets. For example, the AMD Athlon family of processors offer many versions of Athlon. Among these are the Athlon X2 dual core, the Athlon Neo, and the Athlon 64 X2 dual core. Because these various processors within the same processor family use different sockets, you must be careful when matching a processor to the motherboard. When AMD introduced the new 940-pin socket AM2 Athlon 64 processor to the world, it also effectively retired hundreds of different sockets like 754, 939, 940, K8 heatsinks, which are not compatible with the new post AM2 heatsink retention frame. While physically speaking, the AM2 processor is nearly identical to the previous generations of socket 754, socket 939, and socket 940. AMD K8 processors, the way heatsinks attached to it is different in one very significant aspect. Socket 754 940 heatsink frame. The new plastic retention frame used with the Athlon 64 is made of glass-filled Lexan, and in addition to providing a very firm place for the socket 754 heatsink to grip onto, keeps instructions out of the way. On October 19th, AMD officially launched the latest version of successful AMD 64 processor line, the 2.4 GHz Athlon 64-4000 Plus. PC Stats spent a few weeks with this CPU prior to its release, and after running the silicon through its paces, we have come to a couple of conclusions. First International Computer, FIC, have been producing some pretty good sockets. A solution for a while now has helped them improve their penetration into North American retail markets. The company, which was founded in 1980, is better known in Asia, where consumers are motivated by value pricing and bare bones systems. So this is what you really need to know about processor sockets. Pay close attention to all the AMD sockets and their family of processors, all the Intel sockets and family of their processors, and the precautions that you need to take when you are replacing a socket processor and when you are placing a new processor into the socket. This concludes the processor sockets. Thank you for watching A+ Certification 2009 review. Please recommend PC Mac Plus on YouTube to your colleagues and friends.